The deep ocean grows giants, and there's a real biological reason it keeps doing it. Squid the size of small cars, sharks older than the United States, jellyfish longer than blue whales. Crabs you could trip over and barely notice, all of them living in a place that, by every rule we know about how size works, should produce the exact opposite. By the end of this, you'll know what's actually down there, why evolution keeps churning it out oversized, where the food for those bodies comes from, and what it means for the ocean you grew up thinking you understood. Look at the ocean. Now, look deeper. Somewhere under the Antarctic ice tonight, a squid weighing 700 kilograms is drifting through black water, hunting with eyes the size of basketballs. Somewhere under the Arctic, a shark that was alive when Napoleon was a kid is still swimming through the cold, slow enough that you'd swear its heart had stopped. And in a pitch-black trench 7 kilometers below sea level, a creature with a 60-centimeter leg span is walking across a piece of seafloor no human has ever seen, and nobody will see for years to come. We've sent more satellites to Mars than submarines to the bottom of our own ocean. We've mapped the surface of an entire other planet in higher resolution than the floor of our own. Less than 5% of the deep has been visually explored. And every time we go down, we keep finding animals that shouldn't logically exist. Animals far too big for the food available, far too big for the pressure they're under, far too big for the cold they live in, far too big for what the environment should allow. So, why are they so massive? Why does the deep, of all places, a place with less food, less light, less oxygen, less of everything surface biology says you need to grow big, keep producing the largest, weirdest, oldest, and most extreme animals on Earth? Biology shouldn't be doing what it's doing down there. And what does any of it mean for the part of the planet we've barely entered? That's what this video is about. We're going to go all the way down, meet the giants one by one, figure out the actual answer to why they exist at this scale, find out what they eat in a place that should have no food, and come back up understanding what's underneath everything we've ever called the ocean. Start with the basic math of the planet. The ocean covers more than 70% of Earth's surface, more than every continent combined, more than every desert, forest, mountain range, and city stacked together. And out of all that water, we've explored less than 5% of its depths. Less than 5%. Take a moment with that number. Earth's dominant feature, the part that defines the look of the planet from space, is a place humans have barely entered. Mars, sitting 225 million kilometers away, has been mapped at higher resolution than the floor of our own ocean. Even the far side of the Moon, which we have never set foot on, has been imaged in finer detail than most of the abyssal plain sitting directly under our feet. So when you picture Earth, you're really picturing a thin, habitable skin on top of a place we've barely entered. Now, imagine sinking. Imagine yourself dropping straight down through the water, slowly taking it zone by zone. The first 200 meters is the sunlit zone, the epipelagic, where almost every fish, dolphin, coral reef, and beach photograph you've ever seen actually lives. This is the only part of the ocean where photosynthesis can happen, the only part where plants grow, and the only part most people ever picture when someone says the ocean. Past 200 meters, less than 1% of surface light remains, and you're in the twilight zone. The mesopelagic, going down to 1,000 meters. By the bottom of that zone, the water is approaching black, broken only by occasional bioluminescent flashes from animals making their own light. Below 1,000 meters, sunlight stops entirely, and the only light left is biological flashes and glowing lures produced by the animals themselves. That's the midnight zone, bathypelagic, going down to 4,000. Under that is the abyssopelagic, a flat, cold black plain stretching across an area larger than every continent on Earth combined. And below 6,000 meters, in trenches named after the Greek underworld, sits the Hadal Zone, where the deepest fish ever filmed survive at pressures over 1,000 atmospheres. Now layer in the conditions. The temperature drops to a steady 2 to 4 degrees Celsius and stays there, not for a season, not for a year, but for millions of years without changing. Picture that for a second. Deep ocean temperature has been roughly the same since before mammals existed, since before the dinosaurs evolved, since before trees, since before vertebrates with legs. Pressure climbs by 1 atmosphere every 10 meters of depth, until, at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, more than 1,000 atmospheres are pressing on every square inch of every surface. A nuclear submarine sent down there would be crushed flat in seconds. Silence in the deep is near absolute. No surface storms, no wave action, no weather, no human noise. Nothing but the occasional low-frequency vibration from a passing whale or a tectonic shift in the crust. No seasons, no storms, no day or night, no weather of any kind. Just a slow, ancient stillness that has been running uninterrupted for longer than most species have existed on Earth. But here's the thing. By every rule we know about how life on Earth actually works, nothing should be alive down in the deep at all. And the deeper you go, the more impossible the rules say survival should be. Plants need sunlight, and sunlight stops at 200 meters. Animals need food, and most food chains start with plants. Even the parts of life that don't directly need light usually depend on the temperatures, the chemistry, the predictability, and the regular cycles of the surface world. None of that exists down there. Cold past 4 degrees should slow metabolisms past the point of being able to grow anything at all. Pressure over 1,000 atmospheres should crush every biological structure we know how to design. Silence and stillness should mean no signaling, no movement, no ecosystem worth the name, no behavior worth observing. Take any animal you know, a dog, a fish from a stream, a bird, a salamander, and drop it into Hadal Zone conditions. It dies in seconds. Pressure flattens it. Cold seizes its muscles. Darkness blinds its eyes. Starvation kicks in before it can even register that it's lost. By every metric biology uses to define survival, the deep is a death zone. And yet, something is alive down there. Plenty of somethings, in fact, and they aren't just barely alive, scraping by at the edge of biological viability. They're thriving in forms that defy what surface biology says should be possible. Down there, populations exist, ecosystems run, food webs and reproductive cycles unfold on schedules we can't fully describe yet, and animals are growing into shapes we wouldn't have predicted. They're getting bigger, not smaller, which means either the rules we've been working with are wrong, or the deep is doing something to those rules that we haven't worked out yet. Something is letting life flourish in a place that, on paper, shouldn't host it. The question is what? So, that's what we mean by the deep sea. Therefore, when we use the phrase, we're not talking about a deeper version of the beach or a darker version of a reef. The deep is a separate planet stacked on top of our own, colder than a refrigerator, blacker than any cave, quieter than any room you have ever been in, pressed flat by a weight no surface animal could survive. 5 zones, 11 kilometers, no sun, no seasons, nothing the human body was built to handle. By the time you've sunk past the twilight zone, you've left every ecosystem you've ever seen behind. And once you understand that the deep is its own world, with its own physics and its own rules, the rest of this story starts to make sense, because nothing that lives down there had any reason to evolve the way we did. So we've established that the deep is its own planet, which means if it's its own planet, it gets its own biology, and what's actually living down there breaks every rule surface biology has about how size, food, pressure, and survival are supposed to work. The rule that says bigger costs more, so smaller wins, gets flipped on its head. Down in the deep, bigger wins, and bigger wins by an absurd, undeniable margin that biologists keep stumbling into across completely unrelated species. The more researchers have looked, the more they've realized this isn't a coincidence. It's a pattern repeating across completely unrelated animals that have nothing else in common except where they live. It has a name now, its own scientific literature, and a growing list of new entries from every deep sea expedition that goes out. So what is that pattern exactly? How big are we actually talking? And why does it keep showing up, no matter which corner of the deep you sample? Down in that dark, biologists noticed something strange. Across completely unrelated species, in completely unrelated parts of the deep, the same pattern kept showing up. Animals down there weren't slightly bigger than their shallow water cousins. They were absurdly, impossibly large for what biology should have allowed. Not a little bigger, but genuinely, measurably, repeatedly, undeniably larger than anyone could explain. So, scientists eventually gave the pattern a name: deep sea gigantism. The tendency of deep ocean species to grow vastly larger than their shallow water relatives, sometimes by an order of magnitude or more. The numbers are wild. A pill bug at the beach fits on your fingernail, while its deep sea cousin, the giant isopod, grows to 50 centimeters. 1.5 foot of armored creature crawling along the seafloor like a tank from another planet. A shallow water squid weighs about 1 kilogram, while the colossal squid drifting through Antarctic depths weighs 700. That's the difference between a chicken and a small car in animals built on basically the same body plan, same lineages, same body plans, same ancestors, wildly different scales. Humans noticed this long before science could explain it. Sailors hauled up oarfish over 10 meters long and called them sea serpents. Tentacles the size of fence posts washed ashore and turned into the legend of the Kraken. Whalers in the 1800s pulled squid beaks the size of human fists out of sperm whale stomachs and guessed the squid had to be at least 15 meters long, a guess that turned out to be roughly right. These weren't myths from nothing. They were real animals, glimpsed from the edge of a world humans couldn't yet enter. And deep-sea gigantism has cousins. Polar gigantism produces oversized amphipods and sea spiders in cold, shallow waters at the poles. Insular gigantism produces oversized lizards, rodents, birds, and insects on isolated islands. All three share a common thread. Populations are isolated, environments are stable, predators are sparse, and competition has dropped away. Different geographies running the same evolutionary experiment, same end result every time, bigger. But here's where it gets weird, because by every standard rule of biology, Gigantism in the deep is the last thing that should be happening down there. Big bodies need a lot of food, and the deep has almost none. Most deep-sea animals eat once every few weeks at best, sometimes once a year, sometimes once every couple of years, occasionally less than that. Oxygen down there is patchy and unreliable, which should limit how much tissue any animal can build and maintain. Cells need warm enough temperatures to actually divide and tissues to actually build, and the deep sits at 2 to 4 degrees Celsius for millions of years without changing. Add up those rules: scarce food, scarce oxygen, low temperatures, crushing pressure. The prediction biology gives is small. Picture tiny conservative bodies hugging the seafloor, just barely making it through to the next meal. Picture creatures the size of insects, slow and minimal, surviving on as little as possible, because every calorie has to be hauled down from the surface above. That's what every textbook on metabolism and energy budgets, written by anyone who has ever studied how bodies use food, would tell you to expect from a place like the deep. And it's wrong. Not slightly wrong, but catastrophically wrong, in the opposite direction. The deep is full of giants, pillbugs the size of footballs, squid the weight of cars, sharks longer than buses, jellyfish stretching past blue whales. The same conditions that biology says should be producing the smallest, most conservative bodies on Earth are actually producing the largest. So, why are these animals enormous? Why does evolution keep arriving at the same answer, bigger, when every variable in the environment screams smaller? And why does it happen in completely unrelated species, in completely unrelated lineages, in completely unrelated parts of the deep, in lineages that haven't shared a common ancestor in hundreds of millions of years, with such consistency that the phenomenon has its own name and its own scientific literature? So the strangeness isn't an illusion. Therefore, everything early sailors reported, the serpents, the krakens, the impossible tentacles washing up on beaches, wasn't superstition. It was observation filtered through fear and a lack of vocabulary. All fish exist. The colossal squid swims in our oceans today, weighing as much as a small car, and pillbugs the size of dinner plates patrol the abyssal plain right now. Deep-sea gigantism is a measurable, photographable pattern that keeps showing up across unrelated branches of the animal kingdom. Mollusks, crustaceans, fish, jellyfish, even worms. And when a pattern repeats that consistently, in lineages that haven't shared a common ancestor in hundreds of millions of years, you stop asking whether it's real and start asking what force is producing it. So before we go looking for that force, before we try to figure out what's making the deep churn out giants, we should probably know which giants we're actually talking about. Not in the abstract. The actual animals, their names, their sizes, where they live, what they look like, how they behave when nobody's watching. Because once you can picture them, the rest of this story changes from a biology lecture into something a lot more interesting. The numbers we just threw around: 700 kilos, 11 meters, 50 centimeters, 300 years old, only land when there's a body attached to them. So let's go meet them. Group by group, lineage by lineage. Squid the size of small cars, sharks older than the United States, jellyfish longer than blue whales, crabs you could trip over and barely notice, tube worms with no mouths, sponges older than the Roman Empire. These aren't theoretical animals. They're sitting in the deep right now, doing exactly what they've been doing for centuries, and you're about to actually meet each one. Picture yourself in a submersible, slowly descending past the twilight zone, lights flicking on as the windows blacken. This is the part where you start meeting them, not as scientific names on a page, but as bodies drifting past the glass. Some you've heard rumors of, others have never been filmed, and a few have never even been named. The deep doesn't have one or two famous giants, it has whole categories of them, organized by lineage. Cephalopods drift in one part of the column, crustaceans patrol the seafloor, sharks cruise the abyssal mid-layers, fish ribbon through the dark, jellyfish and siphonophores stretch through midwater like ghosts. And the bottom dwellers, worms, spiders, sponges, sit on the seafloor like furniture from another planet. Before any of the science about why they grow so big makes sense, you have to know what's actually down there, what it looks like, and how strange the inventory really is. But here's what should be obvious once you've laid them out side by side. None of these are exceptions. Colossal squid aren't weird outliers. They have cousins like the giant squid and the bigfin squid doing the same thing at the same scale, with each cousin lineage producing its own version of enormous. Greenland sharks aren't anomalies either. The megamouth and the blunt-nosed six-gill share their lineage of absurd for the depth size, and every other deep shark Greenland is related to leans toward oversized bodies and long lifespans. Giant isopods sit next to Japanese spider crabs in the same broader family of oversized for their group. Big red jellyfish share the gelatinous space with lions' manes and giant siphonophores at similar scales, all running the same gelatinous giant playbook in slightly different forms. Look at the pattern as a whole, and the picture gets harder to dismiss. Across mollusks, crustaceans, sharks, bony fish, cnidarians, even worms and sponges, branches of life that haven't shared a common ancestor in hundreds of millions of years. Branches that don't even use the same body plan, the same reproductive strategy, the same nervous system architecture, or the same evolutionary timeline. The deep keeps generating the same body plan. Enormous, colossal squid evolved gigantism on one branch, Greenland sharks on another, giant isopods on a third, giant tube worms on a fourth, giant sea spiders on a fifth. 5 completely separate experiments arriving at the same conclusion. No shared playbook, no shared ancestor, no shared starting point, no shared environmental history. And yet, the result is the same every single time. And when a result keeps showing up that consistently across that many unrelated lineage, in places that don't communicate with each other genetically, in environments scattered across the entire ocean, it stops being a coincidence. Coincidence runs out of statistical room. What you're looking at is convergent evolution being driven by something the surface doesn't have. A force, a set of forces, an environmental fingerprint, a set of pressures pushing every lineage that lives down there toward the same answer. The question now isn't whether the giants are real. The question is, what's making them? There's a force at work down there that the surface doesn't have. So, now you've met them. Therefore, the abstract idea of giants in the deep has names and bodies you can picture. A 700-kilo squid drifts in Antarctic waters with eyes the size of basketballs. Greenland sharks alive today were swimming when Napoleon was a child. Some jellyfish colonies stretch longer than a blue whale. Spider crabs reach 4-meter leg spans. These aren't artists' impressions or speculation. Every one of them has been photographed, weighed, and in many cases pulled from the water in front of witnesses. The deep isn't a rumor. It's a stocked aquarium most people have never been allowed to visit, full of animals that by sheer scale outclass almost anything walking on land. And we share a planet with all of them, right now, separated only by a few thousand meters of water. So you've seen the bestiary. The animals are real. They're enormous. They exist on the same planet you do, and they're not going anywhere. Which brings us back to the original question, the one that's been sitting in the background this entire time. The one a 700-kilogram squid and a 500-year-old shark and a 40-meter siphonophore all keep pointing at. Why? Why are they all this size? And why does evolution, given the chance to do anything with a body down there, keep choosing make it bigger? Surface biology has been trying to answer this for over a century. Scientists have proposed rules, hypotheses, mathematical models, evolutionary frameworks. Kleiber's rule, Bergmann's rule, the island rule, the predation release hypothesis, K-selection, and a handful more. And the answer, when you actually look at it, is way more interesting and way weirder than, oh, the deep is just like that. It involves physics, chemistry, ecology, and geological time, stacked together in a very specific way that doesn't happen anywhere else on Earth. Once you've seen them, the obvious question is, why? Why does a pill bug stay small at the beach but balloon to the size of a cat in the deep? Why does a squid that weighs a kilogram in shallow water grow to 700 kilograms in the Antarctic abyss? For most of scientific history, nobody had a clean answer. Biologists from Darwin onward saw the pattern, recorded it, named it, and still couldn't agree on what was causing it. Different scientists proposed different mechanisms, some pointing to the cold, some to the pressure, others to the lack of predators, the slow food supply, the long lifespans, or the simple isolation of the deep. By the late 20th century, biology had collected a long list of contenders: Kleiber's rule, Bergmann's rule, the oxygen temperature hypothesis, the predation release hypothesis, the island rule, K-selection, each defended by different researchers, each tested against different animals, each supported by partial evidence, and each able to explain some of the gigantism, but not all of it. But here's the catch. Take any one of these explanations alone, plug it into a different environment, and the prediction breaks down. Kleiber's rule applies everywhere on Earth. Elephants and shrews follow it equally, and yet desert animals don't grow into 50-centimeter pill bugs, even though the desert is also a low-food environment where metabolic efficiency should matter. Bergmann's rule applies in any cold environment, but plenty of cold environments don't produce gigantism. Cold, shallow seas, cold lakes, cold deserts, cold mountaintops, all of them have plenty of small animals living in them. The cold alone isn't enough. Buoyancy applies to every fish at every depth, but most shallow water fish stay small. Predation release applies on plenty of isolated islands, and you get the occasional dodo or giant tortoise, but you don't get jellyfish the length of a basketball court, or sharks that live for 500 years. The island rule works in the deep, but it also works on actual islands, and the maximum size on islands is nowhere near the maximum size in the deep. K-selection produces long-lived animals on the surface too, but those long-lived surface animals don't reach the dimensions Greenland sharks do. Each hypothesis explains a piece of the puzzle, but each one is also incomplete on its own, applying in plenty of places where the giants never appear. So, what makes the deep different? Why does it produce the result that all of these hypotheses, applied separately to other environments, fail to produce? Why does Kleiber's rule plus cold plus buoyancy plus predation release equal colossal squid in the deep, but Kleiber's rule plus cold plus buoyancy plus predation release in a cold shallow sea equals just regular fish? Something about the combination, the specific stacking of forces, the specific environment they're stacking in, the specific amount of time they're given to operate, and the specific genetic clay each lineage starts from is producing a result that no individual force plugged in elsewhere has ever produced. The question isn't whether each piece is true. The question is why the deep is the only place on Earth where the pieces add up to giants. So there isn't a single answer. Therefore, the question, why do they grow so big, doesn't have one cause behind it. It has a stack of causes that all point in the same direction at the same time. Cold slows metabolism, and metabolism that slow turns time itself into a resource. Pressure passes harmlessly through bodies built of water and oil. Buoyancy carries weight that gravity could never support. Oxygen-rich cold water feeds more tissue. Sparse predators relax the cost of being big, and sparse food rewards the efficiency of being big. Long lives let slow growth keep going for centuries. Every one of those forces is mild on its own, but stacked together over millions of years on isolated populations with nowhere else to go. They bend bodies upward in size until what would be a 6-inch pillbug at the surface ends up as a 50-centimeter armored tank on the seafloor. So we have our stack of reasons: cold metabolism, buoyancy, pressure equalization, predation release, time. Add them up and you can see how the deep grows things big. But notice what we just glossed over. All of those explanations assume there are meals at all. They assume food is showing up somehow in a place that has no plants, no sunlight, no farms, no agricultural chain, and no obvious source of calories. You can have all the metabolic efficiency in the world, but if there's nothing to eat, you starve. You can have all the buoyancy advantage you want, but a 700-kilogram body doesn't run on physics, it runs on fuel. So where exactly is the food coming from? In a place with no plants, no sunlight, no growing season, and no obvious food chain. What are these giants actually eating? And how is there enough of it down there in the dark to feed an animal the size of a small car? Before going further into the why, there's a problem that needs answering. If the deep sea is dark, cold, and far below anything photosynthetic, what are these giants actually eating? On the surface, the food chain starts with sunlight. Plants and plankton capture solar energy. Herbivores eat the plants, predators eat the herbivores, and the whole system runs on photons. None of that applies down there. There's no sunlight past 1,000 meters, no plants, no grazing, no photosynthesis at all. The deep should, in theory, be one of the most food-starved environments on the planet. And yet, it grows the largest invertebrates on Earth, keeps sharks alive for half a millennium, supports vent ecosystems, and produces siphonophores longer than blue whales. Whatever the deep is eating, it's enough to build a 700-kilogram squid. So the question becomes, where is all that energy coming from? And how does it find its way down into the dark? But here's what makes this strange. Until 1977, what I just told you about the deep's food economy should not have been possible. Marine biology, up until that point, was built on the assumption that all life on Earth, every animal, every plant, every microbe, every single living thing, ultimately ran on sunlight. The chain went sun, plants, herbivores, carnivores, decomposers. Take away the sun, and the food chain collapses. That was textbook, the foundation of how we thought ecosystems worked. Pull the sun out of the equation, and biology, as understood at the time, had no model for how anything could survive long term. Then, in 1977, a submarine named Alvin descended to a vent on the Galapagos Rift, and the scientists looking out the porthole saw something they had no framework for. Clams the size of dinner plates, mussels the size of footballs, 2-meter tube worms swaying in water hundreds of degrees Celsius, vent crabs scuttling around in pure heat. No sunlight at any step. It was an entire ecosystem running on chemistry alone, where the textbook said no ecosystem could exist. And it wasn't just one weird vent. Once they knew what to look for, the same thing showed up at vents around the world. Every mid-ocean ridge, every active fissure, every place where superheated water erupted from inside the Earth. Every spot on the ocean floor where chemistry leaked out, ringed with thriving communities of giant chemosynthesis-based animals. The same story showed up at cold seeps, around whale falls, anywhere the deep concentrated chemistry or nutrition, life concentrated around it, often at massive sizes. So the question stopped being how the deep survives without the sun. The question became, how much of the planet's life actually doesn't need the sun at all? Maybe the sun-driven food web is the special case, not the default. Maybe what's actually old, ubiquitous, fundamental, and quietly running the planet's biology is chemosynthesis, not photosynthesis. And if that's true, the deep isn't just a strange branch of biology. It's the original branch, and the rest of us, up here, are the recent improvisation. So the deep isn't starving. Therefore, everything we assumed about how food works, sunlight, plants, herbivores, predators, turns out to be only one model of how an ecosystem can run. Marine snow drips down constantly, a slow, steady rain of organic crumbs from the world above. Whale falls drop entire decade-long feasts onto the seafloor. Hydrothermal vents host life that has never needed sunlight at all, running entirely on sulfur chemistry pumped up from inside the Earth. The deep eats differently. It eats slower, rarer, and weirder than anything we're used to, but it eats. And the size of the animals down there is direct evidence that whatever the deep is doing for calories, it's working well enough to grow a 700-kilogram squid in the dark. So the food question is answered, or at least partially answered. The deep eats through marine snow, whale falls, vent chemistry, and a few other channels we'd never have predicted. But the food doesn't fall evenly across the seafloor. Marine snow falls heavier in some places than others. Whale falls cluster along the migration routes of large whales. Vents only exist at specific geological seams in the planet, and cold seeps only leak in particular sediments. Which means the deep isn't a uniform habitat for giants. Some patches of the deep are calorie-dense, others are calorie deserts, some have chemistry leaking out of the rock, and others have nothing at all. And the largest, weirdest creatures down there tend to live in some very specific places, places that are, in their own way, more extreme than the deep itself. So, where exactly do the biggest giants gather? What makes those particular spots different from the rest of the dark? And why are those spots also, almost always, the most hostile environments we've ever measured on Earth? And the deep doesn't grow giants everywhere equally. Different giants live in very different places, and the places themselves are stranger than most people realize. The trenches, narrow, vertical gashes in the ocean floor, drop down to 11 kilometers in the Mariana, the Kermadec, the Tonga, the Japan Trench, each one isolated from the others, each one running its own private evolution. The polar abyss, Arctic and Antarctic, holds cold oxygen-loaded water that produces some of the largest invertebrates ever recorded. Hydrothermal vents, first discovered only in 1977 along the Galapagos Rift, host whole communities that have never needed sunlight to exist. Cold seeps leak methane out of the seafloor and grow forests of pale, mouthless worms. And brine pools, hypersaline underwater lakes that sit on the ocean floor with visible borders like swimming pools, occasionally trap and preserve animals that swim into them by mistake. Each of these places is, in effect, its own planet. But here's the thing, each of these places, looked at individually, should be lethal. The Mariana Trench has pressures that crush submarines on contact. Polar waters sit cold enough to freeze cells in any normal animal, with seawater hovering right at the threshold where ice can form inside biological tissue. Hydrothermal vents have water hot enough to melt human skin in seconds, sitting right next to water just above freezing, meaning an animal living on a vent has to handle hundreds of degrees of temperature shift across a single body length, while simultaneously handling pressure, darkness, and a chemistry that includes sulfur compounds toxic to almost every other living thing on Earth. Brine pools are saturated with so much salt and dissolved methane that anything swimming into one dies almost instantly. These aren't difficult places. They're places where, by every standard the surface uses to measure habitability, nothing should be alive at all. A human in any of these environments would be dead in seconds. A surface fish would last about the same. Even hardy land animals, tardigrades, extremophile bacteria, ants, desert-adapted insects wouldn't last through more than a fraction of the conditions any of these environments routinely produce. And yet, each one is full of giants, not just survivors, but actual giants. The biggest amphipods on the planet live in the Mariana Trench. The biggest sea spiders live in the polar abyss. The biggest tube worms live at hydrothermal vents, and the biggest chemosynthetic mussels live at cold seeps. It's the inversion of every habitability assumption we've ever made. The places we'd predict to be the most barren turn out to be where the most extreme bodies cluster. The places we'd label uninhabitable end up hosting the largest, oldest, slowest growing, longest lived animals on the planet. The deep doesn't just survive in these places. It throws its largest, oldest, weirdest, most extreme animals into them, on purpose, generation after generation, as if the deep specifically uses environmental hostility as a kind of growth medium. Which means the hostility isn't a bug, it's a feature. The very conditions that should be killing life down there are exactly the conditions producing the most spectacular versions of it. So geography matters down there too. Therefore, the deep isn't one uniform habitat. It's a patchwork of extremes, and each patch produces its own kind of giant. Down in the Mariana Trench, snailfish survive 1,000 atmospheres of pressure. Polar abyss waters grow sea spiders the size of dinner plates and colossal squid the size of small cars. Hydrothermal vents host 2-meter tube worms that have no mouth at all. Cold seeps support mussel beds, and pale worms that feed on methane. Each environment imposes its own rules, and the animals that win in each one look almost nothing like the winners next door. The deep isn't a single ecosystem with giants scattered through it. It's dozens of separate worlds, each running its own evolutionary experiment, each producing its own answer to the question of how big a body can get when the conditions stop arguing against it. So the giants cluster in the most extreme corners of the deep, the trenches, the vents, the brine pools, the polar abyss. They thrive in places that should kill anything that swims into them, which raises an obvious follow-up. How? How do you actually survive in water that's 1,000 atmospheres heavier than the surface? In water that goes from 400 degrees Celsius to near freezing in the span of a meter, in water saturated with methane, in trenches so isolated every animal in them is genetically unique. Size alone doesn't explain it. Being big doesn't keep your proteins from collapsing under pressure, doesn't stop ice crystals from forming in your cells, doesn't help you find prey when there's no light to see by, doesn't slow your metabolism enough to survive on a meal every 5 years. There has to be something else, a second toolkit beyond size that these animals are using to survive what they survive. So what does that toolkit look like? What tricks has evolution invented down there that don't exist anywhere else on Earth? And what does it cost an animal to use them? And then there's everything else. Size is the headline, but it's not the only thing evolution has been doing down there. To survive in cold, dark, high-pressure water with almost no food and almost no light, animals have had to invent solutions that don't exist anywhere else in the biosphere. Many of them make their own light, while others have eyes the size of softballs. A few have transparent bodies that vanish when seen from the side or glow on their bellies to disappear against the faint light above. Their cells carry special enzymes called piezolites to keep proteins folded under pressures that should crush them. Their heartbeats run so slow you'd miss them if you weren't looking. Polar species carry antifreeze proteins to keep their cells from crystallizing in near-freezing water. All of this exists alongside the gigantism woven into the same animals, the same lineages, the same evolutionary history. The deep doesn't just produce big animals. It produces a completely separate toolkit of adaptations, most of which surface biology never even attempted. But here's where it gets stranger. None of these adaptations evolved just once. Bioluminescence, the ability for an animal to make its own light using chemistry inside its body, has evolved independently at least 40 separate times across the tree of life. 40. That's not a refinement of one trick. That's the same problem getting solved from scratch by completely unrelated lineages in completely unrelated time periods, over and over, because the deep keeps demanding it. Antifreeze proteins evolved separately in Antarctic fish and Arctic fish, despite the two groups being completely unrelated and separated by an entire planet. Different lineages, different oceans, same exact molecular solution arrived at independently. Piezolites evolved independently in deep-sea microbes and in deep-sea animals. Single-celled organisms and complex multicellular bodies running into the same pressure problem and arriving at the same kind of enzyme to solve it. Transparency evolved over and over in jellyfish, in squid, in larval fish, in shrimp, in juvenile octopus. Every gelatinous or weakly pigmented body in the deep keeps reinventing the trick of becoming invisible. Pressure-resistant cell membranes, slow metabolism strategies, oversized eyes, counter-illumination. Each adaptation has multiple independent origins across deep-sea lineages, and those are just the famous ones. This is convergent evolution turned up to maximum. The same solutions keep getting invented from scratch by lineages that share no ancestor in the relevant time frame and no genetic toolkit for the solutions they're independently arriving at. Which means the deep isn't just pressuring evolution, it's funneling it. Every lineage that survives down there ends up looking strangely similar to every other lineage that survives down there. Not because they're related, but because the environment forces them into the same answers regardless of where they started. The deep doesn't permit variety in survival strategy, it permits only the strategies that work. And the strategies that work all look essentially the same. So size isn't the only trick the deep teaches. Therefore, alongside gigantism, evolution down there has been quietly inventing a toolkit of survival strategies that would look like superpowers anywhere else. Roughly 3/4 of deep-sea animals make their own light, for hunting, for hiding, for mating signals, for warning off rivals. Eyes the size of softballs catch single photons. Transparent bodies erase silhouettes. Counter-illumination lets an animal glow on its belly, so it disappears against the faint light above. Piezo lights hold proteins together at pressures that should crush them. Antifreeze proteins keep cells from freezing in polar water. The giants of the deep aren't just big, they're built out of solutions to problems we've barely begun to study, and every one of those solutions is a question evolution answered long before we even knew the question existed. So now you've got the full toolkit: size plus bioluminescence, oversized eyes, transparency, slow metabolism, piezo lights, and antifreeze. That's how the giants survive, and that's how evolution solves the deep. And on the surface, this is the part of a documentary where the music swells and the host says, and scientists are still learning more every day. Don't believe it. Because the truth is, the more deep-sea biology learns, the less complete the picture looks. The answers we've gotten so far are good, but they're tiny next to the questions still sitting on the table. Questions about why some lineages become giants while their close relatives stay small, why there might or might not be an upper size limit, what those sounds nobody can identify are, what those shadows nobody can explain belong to, and what species we haven't even named yet are doing right now somewhere we can't reach. So, what don't we know? What's still down there, waiting to be discovered? And how comfortable should you actually be with how little science can tell you about a place that takes up most of the planet you live on? And for all of this, all the hypotheses, all the measurements, all the named species and confirmed adaptations, biology still hits a wall when it comes to the deep. Most of the ocean floor has never been seen by human eyes. The fraction directly observed is smaller than the percentage of the moon's surface we've mapped. Submersibles are expensive, slow, and limited to tiny windows of time. ROVs and AUVs cover more ground, but most of the deep remains untouched by any camera, any net, any human tool, any direct observation at all. New species are pulled out on almost every expedition, and every time researchers think they've figured out a piece of the gigantism puzzle, a new species shows up that breaks the pattern, lives somewhere it shouldn't, grows in a way nobody predicted, or simply doesn't fit any existing category. The deep keeps embarrassing the textbooks. But here's what makes the mystery worse, not better. With every other field of science, more research closes questions. You investigate, you learn, you build a model, You fill in the blank spaces on the map. Unknowns shrink as the work progresses. That's how science is supposed to work. Map a star, sequence a gene, identify a particle, classify a fossil, describe a chemical reaction. Each act of research closes a small piece of mystery. With the deep, the opposite has been happening for decades. Every submersible dive returns with new species. New sonar passes keep picking up shadows that nobody can identify. Hydrophone deployments capture sounds no known animal makes. Each year, new genera and entire families get described from samples that came up the previous summer. The 1990s bloop, that famous low-frequency sound that turned out to be icequakes, was one of many unexplained recordings, and most of the others are still unexplained, still sitting in archives, still waiting for a match that hasn't come. As we've explored more strangeness has piled up at the edges of what we've measured. Not less, undescribed species lists grow faster than described species lists. Unidentified sound archives grow faster than we can analyze them. New sonar contacts keep getting added without identification, and new genera get described faster than we can document where they live. We aren't converging on an understanding of the deep. We're diverging from it. Honestly, the most accurate way to describe the current state of deep-sea biology is that we know enough to know how much we don't know, and the gap is widening faster than our submarines can close it. And the implications are uncomfortable. If we don't know what's down there, we can't say what we're losing when we damage it. We can't say what we're missing in our models of how life works. And we can't even predict with confidence whether the strangest things in the deep have already been found, or whether they're still waiting somewhere we haven't reached yet. The deep isn't a finished map, it's a frontier. We're still in the early chapters of opening up, and every chapter so far has added more questions than answers. So, the mystery isn't solved. Therefore, for every clean answer biology has handed us about why these animals grow so big, the deep has handed back 2 new questions we can't answer yet. We don't know why some lineages become giants while their close relatives stay small. We don't know if there's an upper size limit, or if something even larger than the colossal squid is drifting through water no submersible has reached. Sonar still picks up shadows the size of small ships that nobody can identify. Hydrophones still record sounds nobody can explain. Almost every deep-sea expedition pulls up species that have never been named or described and never appeared in any textbook. The deep isn't a finished map. It's a place we're still in the process of meeting. And the longer we look, the more it seems the strangest things we know about life on Earth are also the things we know the least about. So the deep is still mostly unknown. We've named maybe a fraction of what lives there, and every dive turns up more, which is exciting, but it should also worry you, because if we don't know what's down there, we don't know what we're losing when we damage it, and we are damaging it right now, faster than we're naming the species we're killing. Trawlers are dragging the abyssal plain as we speak. Mining companies are mapping vent fields for extraction. Microplastics have already reached the deepest trench on Earth, and warming polar waters are quietly shifting the chemistry that keeps the giants alive. The same animals we just spent this whole video meeting, the Greenland sharks, the giant tube worms, the colossal squid, the deep coral fields older than the pyramids, are running into the first wave of human pressure on the deep, and they have none of the biological tools to survive it. So, what's actually happening to them? And what does it look like when human speed damage meets a world that runs on geological time? And the deeper into the deep we look, the clearer it becomes that this whole system was never built for sudden change. Surface ecosystems are used to disturbance. Forests burn and regrow. Coral reefs bleach and recover. Grasslands die back in droughts and recover in wet years. The deep doesn't work that way. Animals down there grow slowly, reproduce rarely, and live for decades or centuries with no fast replacement strategy. Whole environments, coral fields, vent chimneys, brine pools, Haddle Trench communities take thousands or millions of years to assemble. And humans, in the last 50 years, have arrived. Industrial trawlers drag the seabed. Mining companies have begun targeting hydrothermal vents and metal nodule fields, kilometers underwater. Climate change is shifting the chemistry of the cold polar water that grew so many of these giants in the first place. None of this used to reach down there. All of it does now. But here's what makes this different from every other conservation problem we've ever dealt with. The timescales don't match. With surface ecosystems, forests, grasslands, shallow reefs, freshwater systems, there's at least some theoretical recovery on a human-relevant timeline. Burned forests come back in decades. Bleached reefs can sometimes recolonize in a generation. Even decimated populations of land animals can rebuild within a century if you give them protected space. Conservation in the surface world is hard, but at least the math is solvable on a human life timescale. None of that applies to the deep. Greenland shark populations damaged today recover on a 500-year timeline, if at all, because that's how long it takes for one Greenland shark to reach reproductive maturity. Coral fields that took 4,000 years to grow get dragged through by a trawler in one afternoon. Hydrothermal vent communities that took millions of years to evolve get crushed by mining equipment in hours. Damage we can do in a week takes the deep tens of millennia to undo. Think about that ratio. The Roman Empire didn't even exist for the length of time some deep-sea sponges have already been alive. Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, every modern religion combined hasn't run as long as a single Antarctic deep-sea community has been quietly running its current configuration. Recovery on the deep's timeline isn't measured in years or centuries. It's measured in geological epochs. Damage to the deep in any human meaningful sense is permanent. We're operating at human speed in an ecosystem that runs on geological speed, and the two were never designed to interact. There's no precedent for this in conservation history. There's no surface analogy that prepares us for what damage looks like to a system that doesn't reset within human civilizations. And it's all happening right now, with almost no public visibility, in a part of the planet most people will never see in person. The deep can't recover at the speed we're capable of damaging it. The math simply doesn't allow it. So, the giants are vulnerable. Therefore, the thing that makes them remarkable, slow growth, late maturity, long lives, sparse populations, is the exact thing that makes them impossible to replace once we've damaged them. A 200-year-old Greenland shark caught and killed today will not be replaced in any human lifetime. Trawlers dragging the seabed have already scraped clean ancient coral fields that took thousands of years to form. Deep-sea mining now targets the very hydrothermal vents that grow tube worms found nowhere else on Earth. Microplastics have been pulled out of amphipods living at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the deepest point on the planet, and we still managed to contaminate it before we mapped it. We are pressing on a world we haven't even met yet, and the giants down there have no mechanism, biologically or evolutionarily, to recover at the speed we're capable of doing damage. So, that's the situation. The deep is enormous, ancient, full of animals shaped by forces we still don't fully understand, full of pressures and food sources we'd never have predicted. And it's being damaged on a timeline it can't possibly recover from. That's heavy. Let's not end there. Let's come back up. Not to forget what's down there, but to actually understand what we've just covered, all together in one ascent through every zone of the ocean we've talked about. Because the deep doesn't go away when you stop thinking about it. It's still there, right now, beneath every coastline, on every continent. And once you've seen what it actually looks like underneath, you don't get to unsee it. The next time you stand on a beach, the next time you fly over open ocean, the next time you see a documentary about coral reefs, the next time you put your hand in seawater, you'll know what's also below that, in the layers the cameras never reach. So let's surface slowly and see what your own ocean looks like once you know what's actually underneath. And so we begin the slow climb back, up through the Hadal Zone, where pressure starts to ease, then through the abyss where the cold relaxes, past the Midnight Zone, the first faintest hints of blue appearing. Through the Twilight Zone, the light climbing around you, the water turning from black to dark navy to deep blue to the soft pale of sunlit shallows. A journey of hours, covering an entire planet's worth of biology, communities older than civilizations, animals built for conditions no surface life could survive, ecosystems running on chemistry instead of sunlight, geometries of life that don't exist anywhere above. When you break the surface and feel the sun on your face again, the world looks the same as when you left. The boat is still there, the horizon is still flat, the sky is the same color, the waves still move the way they always did. Only one thing has changed. What you know is underneath. But here's the thing about resurfacing. Once you've actually pictured what's underneath, the ocean doesn't look the same anymore. The version you grew up with, the beach where you went on vacation, the dolphins in nature documentaries, the coral reefs in travel magazines, the surfable waves at sunset, isn't really the ocean. It's the lid of the ocean, the water you can see, the water you've been told about, the water everyone has ever filmed, the water in every beach commercial and every David Attenborough special, is just the thin, sunlit top of something enormous, ancient, and almost entirely outside our experience. Everything you've been told about your whole life, every shark documentary, every aquarium visit, every snorkeling trip, every beach photo on your phone, has been about the residents of a thin, sunlit corridor at the very top of something much, much bigger. Colossal squid, Greenland sharks, giant tube worms, lion's mane jellyfish, deep-sea sponges older than any tree. None of them appeared in any nature documentary you watched as a kid, in any aquarium you've visited, in any beach trip you've taken, in any school textbook you remember. They weren't omitted because they're rare. They were omitted because we can't film them, can't reach them, can't bring them to the surface alive, and in many cases, can't even photograph them clearly. What you've known your whole life was edited. The ocean that gets shown on TV is the surface dressing of a planet whose actual marine biology happens somewhere most cameras have never gone. And once you know that, once you know about the colossal squid, the Greenland shark, the giant tube worm, the lion's mane jellyfish, the deep-sea sponge older than the Roman Empire. You can't go back to thinking the ocean is what the documentaries showed. You know what's down there now, and you can't unknow it. The real ocean, the much larger one, lives below the part the cameras have always pointed at. And from now on, every time you look at water, that's what's actually underneath. So, we end where we started, except now you know what's down there. Therefore, the next time you look at a map of the planet, remember that more than 2/3 of it is hidden underwater we've barely entered, and that inside that water, in the cold and the dark, animals older than civilizations are still drifting through it tonight. The colossal squid is hunting in the Antarctic right now. A Greenland shark, born before the American Revolution, is somewhere under the Arctic ice, still growing. Giant tube worms are swaying in vent water nobody has ever filmed. None of this is far away. The deep is directly below us, every day, every hour, every breath you take while reading this. The oldest, largest, most stable ecosystem on Earth, and the one we understand the least about the planet we live on. The deep is below us whether we look or not. This channel keeps looking. Subscribe if you want to keep looking with it, and tell me in the comments which one of those animals you didn't know existed before today.